All right, so welcome into our webinar. Our title here is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. What do you do when everyone has an A? Now, do we mean that literally everyone has an A all the time? Of course not. But what we're here to talk about is the fact that grades have changed a lot over the years, especially parents from when you were in school. And this makes some truths about college admissions fundamentally different in how students should approach them, in how colleges are approaching information on students' applications. And Jordan and I are here to talk you through that. My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. So I oversee our test prep and tutoring for academic subjects, and that's the lens of expertise I bring to this. I'm joined by my colleague Jordan Holmes. Jordan is a former admissions officer, so he's worked at Penn, USC, and American University, and he works with our students on their college essays and applications. Kind of as Jordan says, students aren't cookies, but we help them package themselves. Making sure that students tell their stories in an authentic and compelling way. And so we're here to kind of give different aspects of this, me from the standpoint of students who work or someone who works with students on these academic areas, and Jordan to give the sort of university admissions officer lens. So we should start by talking about what we're really talking about in a presentation like this. And if you've joined one of our previous webinars, you may have seen this graphic before. What it is over time, the percentage of American college freshmen who reported having at least an A- average in high school. We could see when this data started to be collected by UCLA, that number in 1966 was 21.8%. And it's sort of reversed, where it used to be that, fewer than or just over 20% had that A average. Now, just under 20% do not, right? So we've seen a big shift in how grades are viewed in our society. Now, one thing that's important to remember about grading is that it's a cultural practice. So we as a society kind of decide by collective actions what, level of work and participation in class, etc., is meriting an A average at any given time. And that bar has shifted upwards, or rather downwards, depending on how you're looking at it. But the point is that, more students are receiving A's for the work they're putting in at school than ever before. Now, to put this in perspective from some university data, I have here data from the Common Data Set for the University of Pittsburgh. This is the most recent year that they have available. And we can see that of the students who enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh as freshmen during the 24-25 school year, 61% of those students had over a 4.0 GPA. And that's on a 4.0 scale where you get some amount of weighting for honors and AP courses. The average GPA of a University of Pittsburgh freshman was 4.08. And so we can see, parents, this is a flagship state school in the state of Pennsylvania. It's a competitive flagship state school. It's not the most competitive flagship state school. But you can just see that these, expectations from selective colleges on students' grades have shifted. Now, one kind of caveat that's important to note here is that the University of Pittsburgh uses a weighted GPA. I mentioned that they give a little extra weighting for honors and AP courses. If you were to look at this same data for Penn State, it can't be over 4.0 because Penn State does not weight GPAs. 4.0 is actually the highest that you can get by their reckoning. And so universities' data, you have to look at whether they're considering weighted or unweighted GPAs. But for most universities that are considering weighted GPAs, you're going to see data similar to University of Pittsburgh, or at least at most highly selective schools that consider weighted GPA. On the other hand, standardized test scores over this same time are standardized. Sometimes parents ask, well, does that just mean that students are just like way better at school than they were when I was in school? And the data doesn't really reflect that. Again, grading is a cultural practice and it's based on what people are doing in classrooms all over the country. And there's no level of standardization. Tests like the SAT and ACT, they norm their test each year to the American curriculum, to a standard population. And so ACT scores over time have actually stayed relatively steady. And in fact, if you zoom in on ACT scores, And especially if you extrapolate the trend line over the past few years, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic, you can see that these scores have actually trended downwards. So it's not necessarily that students are just way better at school than they used to be. That's causing this rise in the percentage of A's that are being given out. So with that, I'll flip it over to Jordan to talk about the sort of college perspective on all this.
So as a college admission officer, it's a really challenging job to take a look at any individual or any group of students and try to make discersions between them or among them. It's really important to be fair and be objective and know your territory or the group of applicants that you're reading. And the classic example and the classic question that I would get all the time and still sometimes do is if you have two applicants who are, from well reputed high schools, they're doing well, they have upward trajectories, meaning that they went from maybe A's and B's all the way up to A's later on, or some other kind of upward trend grade in grades. How does an admission officer look at these two applications and make differentiations between the two of them? The question I would get in admission all the time is, well, which one are you admitting? You're going to admit the one with the higher GPA and test score, right? The tongue-in-cheek answer and the real answer is that we would just admit both of them because statistically we know that not both of them are going to attend yield rates, things like that. Ask me later. However, in looking at what we're going to talk about today, there are some ways that you can differentiate yourself in the admission pool and make sure that you're putting yourself forward and putting yourself out there in ways that make sense that help admission officers grab onto something that's not just academics, as Jim talked about, which can be kind of similar throughout the application.
Now, one of these answers is what we call academic rigor, which, to put it simply, is the level of the courses that you take. So not all GPAs will be created equal. If, one of those GPAs was in the most rigorous coursework that a school offers and another was not. So that's not to say that every student should absolutely always take the most rigorous course load that their school offers. Of course not. You have to think very long and hard about kind of where you want to challenge yourself and how you want to deploy your time. But the level of your courses is something that you can use to differentiate yourself in this regard. So the way your high school weights GPAs is not as important as people think. And this is a question we get all the time. If it was super important to colleges what weighting system your high school used, then what we'd see is an arms race where, high school A gives, 0.25 extra weight to an AP course. And then high school B says, wait a minute, they're getting more students into target colleges than our students are. So we need to now go to zero point 0.5 for our AP weighting. School C looks at both and say, haha, suckers, I'm going to go to 0.75. And all of a sudden we'd have GPAs out of 70 instead of 4.0. That's not exactly how it's shaken out. So a lot of colleges will recalculate GPAs and they have their own weighting system when they use weighted GPAs. And I believe this is what the University of Pittsburgh does. That 4.08 isn't just the average of every high school in the country's weighting system when they get the application. It's the average after Pitt puts the data into their system and it weights the GPAs in the way that they want to weight the GPAs. So some colleges might weight AP courses, but not honors courses. Or they might have a different weighting for AP and honors versus a standard level course. And you're going to see these things change a lot. So I do just want to say, like, if you're stressing out about the way that your school weights GPAs and you're thinking, well, my friends at a local private school or a different school, are getting higher GPAs than we are, that is not really something that should matter in this process. Admissions officers have technological tools and, of course, just the basic human, tools of discernment to understand when those things are going on. One important aspect of academic rigor is that in a perfect world, a student would have 4 years of the same foreign language. So you'll see different requirements in this regard listed on different university websites. The strictest will be 4 years of a foreign language. I've never seen it say 4 years of the same foreign language, but that is typically viewed more rigorous because you're getting to a higher level at the end of the day of that language, potentially getting to the AP level, and potentially being able to take, some kind of proficiency exam so that you could prove a level of proficiency in the language. Um, The other thing to consider, you will see all the time universities say we only require 2 years of a foreign language. It would still be considered more rigorous to have all four. So that's something to consider. I know a lot of students really struggle in foreign language courses, but as far as what the college's perspective is, that's kind of in a vacuum what they would prefer. Your decisions on course selection are obviously going to be highly personal, and if you can find really valuable ways to spend that time elsewhere, it's not like you must take 4 years of the same foreign language. There are no, absolutes in the college admissions process. But the point here is that, again, this is just what's going to read as the most rigorous coursework to a university. The other thing to think about, and I'm speaking especially to my freshman and sophomore families here, think about what your top math level will be, and especially in the context of what you want to study. And I say that because a lot of students will come to us and say, well, I'm interested in engineering, I'm interested in computer science. And they're looking at really rigorous programs, but they might be in a math class where they'll only get to, say, pre-calculus by senior year. The most rigorous, colleges, or rather the most competitive colleges, especially for those STEM programs, they're going to be looking for students that have gotten into calculus in high school. The higher your math level, again, of course, the better. That doesn't mean, you should kind of bend over backwards to get 3 years ahead in math necessarily, but you do want to make sure you're at least getting calculus under your belt at the time that you're applying to these colleges. Um, you can think about these projected math levels. Typically, the best way to kind of, if you're realizing freshman year, you're doing really well in your math class, you think you want to pursue a math heavy career, then you can consider taking a math course over the summer to skip a level and get on track to take calculus by senior year or to get ahead of calculus by senior year, if it makes sense in your circumstance. So that's not, again, there are no uniform recommendations in this realm or any other, but that's something to just consider. If you're interested in STEM programs, will your math get up to calculus by senior year? Another answer to our question of what do we do when everyone has A's is standardized testing. So, one of the most common ways that a parent will start a test prep planning call with me is by saying, my student is a really strong student, but a poor tester. They have, mostly A's and a handful of B's, but then they have an SAT score around 1,000, right? And while it seems like if you're an A student, an SAT score of 1,000 is, not really equivalent to that. The truth is, if an A minus average means you're in that top 84% of students, right? We said 84% of students have at least an A minus average. A top 84% SAT score is an 800. So to me, a student with mostly A's and a couple B's scoring around 1,000 on the PSAT, the first time they ever look at an SAT style exam, that rings true. I mean, that's roughly accurate. If you're one of the very strongest students in the school and you're in, the highest level courses, A's and A pluses all around, and you're scoring 1,000, then we have a disconnect. But if you're kind of at that A minus end of the spectrum, then that's roughly the score I'd expect from a student. Now, what is standardized testing actually used for in the college admissions process? It can confirm or strengthen a student's academic record. So confirm matters more when a university is unfamiliar with a high school. And so Jordan referenced earlier the territory of an admissions officer. And admissions officers' territories are often assigned geographically. So if we take a local state school, they're going to know your in-state high school very well because chances are they're getting double-digit applications from your high school every year. I once met the Penn State admissions officer for Montgomery, Delaware, and Chester County, right? So three counties in the state knew every high school, right? So that's now at the same time, if you're applying to UCLA, they might have a mid-Atlantic admissions officer that's going to cover, Pennsylvania, Maryland. They're going to cover New Jersey, Virginia, all in that mid-Atlantic territory. And I'm just spitballing what the specific states would be, but the point is they're kind of divvying up those territories by how many applications they're getting from the regions. So a UCLA admissions officer, they might get one or two applications from your high school, but they don't know it by name the way that an in-state university admissions officer would. So standardized testing can be used to confirm an academic record when there's less familiarity with your particular high school from that university. It can strengthen a student's academic record. Maybe there was a situation where, you really didn't gel with the teacher. And it was a shame because it was a course you really liked. It's an area you might want to study, but you ended up with more of a kind of B plus A minus than the A that you would have liked to be able to show to colleges in your, say, math class. Well, if you can turn around and on the SAT or ACT do super, super well in the math section, then that allows you to strengthen your academic record. And you can show, okay, that performance in that course was a blip in the radar because on the nationwide standardized test, I scored in the 95th percentile or whatever the case may be. That's a situation where you can strengthen your academic record. It's a common practice for an AP course as well, because you get the exam that's literally tied to that course. Maybe you're at one of those high schools where, at my high school was AP chemistry. No one got an A in AP chemistry, or maybe one or two students did. But if you can get a B and a 5 out of 5 on the AP test, then you're demonstrating a high level of proficiency at an introductory college level. And that tells the admissions committee, hey, my teacher was a really hard grader, but I did my job here. So these are just examples of a way that standardized testing can strengthen an academic record. When we talk about the point of standardized testing in admissions, it is the single best predictor now of a student's performance in college, particularly first year GPA, but actually GPA all throughout high school, or sorry, all throughout college. So what I have here, this is a study called Opportunity Insights. It studied students at what are called the Ivy Plus colleges, which for the purposes of this study were the 8 Ivy League schools, Stanford, MIT, and the University of Chicago. And in that study, they found that there was a stronger prediction between SAT scores and a student's first year college GPA than there was with their high school GPA and that first year college GPA. Now, Jordan could tell you that for years, the strongest correlation was between the high school GPA and the college GPA. But as we've seen continued grade inflation, with that comes grade compression. So you used to have a GPA spread that was this wide. Now you have a GPA spread that's this wide. And so the numbers tell you less. They have less predictive power, statistically speaking. And so that's one of the things the universities are trying to do. They're trying to admit students who are going to show up on campus and be successful there, who are going to get their degrees, ideally get out in 4 years. At least hopefully the university wants you to, get through in 4 years on time. Not always. But the idea is they want to make sure that they're admitting students who can do the work and succeed, and standardized testing is one more way that you can demonstrate that. Standardized testing can also allow a university to compare a student with their local context. So one thing that travels with your transcript is called a school profile. And it's information about your high school, and particularly it's going to show the average SAT and or ACT scores at your high school. It'll show things like what the highest level courses in each subject area are. And they do this again for that UCLA admissions officer getting an application from the Philadelphia suburbs who has no context for what that school is like. They can look at the school profile, get a rough idea, and then compare students with their own environment. And then finally, it's important to remember that this is part of a holistic review process. So while standardized testing is an important part of what's going on here, Jordan is about to guide us through some of those more holistic factors, some of the more subjective and human elements of the application where students can also shine. So with that, I'll turn it over to him.
Now, I'm fully biased, so I feel like these are the best parts of the application. But these are also ways that you can make sure that you or your student is discerning or rather distinguishing themselves in the application process and really sharing what's important to them. And there's no better way to do that besides the essay than with the extracurricular activities. And this is where colleges just want to make sure that students are participating in something that they care about either in school, outside of school, in their communities, a religious organization, whatever it might be. It does not matter what the student is doing as long as it is important to the student. It is important to the admission officer. That's what I would say to admission or to families when I was an admission officer. If you care about it, we care about it. There's no checklist. There's no I have to do this and that and this and that in order to get in. There's no secret combination or anything like that. But again, we really just want to make sure we admission offices, colleges, want to make sure that the things that you're doing outside of class time are really important to you. And it also goes to this idea of being um, personally authentic and then also pointy. I'll talk about the first. Authentic means that it just means needs to mean something to you or to your student. As long as they really care about FBLA, that business organization, or about their swim team, or about their volunteering organization, then that's all that we care about. There's not anything that colleges are looking for in specifics in order to make an admission or decision, or admission decision rather. I loved talking about being pointy. It is one of the concepts that I like talking about the most because there's this misconception that you need to be well-rounded. You need to be a four-star athlete, and you also need to be a violinist, an accomplished violinist, and you need to be into robotics, and you need to save puppies on the weekends. I don't know what it is, but you really do need to do what is authentic to you and what you care about. And it's okay to be pointy instead of being well-rounded and doing everything. You can have a focus in a couple of different areas, one, two, three, whatever it is. As long as it is important to you and your student, that's completely okay. Intellectual pursuits also matter and also count if there's any sort of independent research that your student has done. Maybe there's an independent project that they have decided to undertake. That can be something that is counted as an extracurricular activity outside of class time. Our co-founder, Carlin, did a TED Talk a few years ago that you probably have seen if you worked with us. But he talks about starting a garage band or a band in the garage with their friends. That's something that's not associated with an organization necessarily, but it is absolutely something that students can and should put on their application. Some of these other pointy bends that we see include civic and social justice, personal interest and curiosities, things that they care about, things that students are just sitting down and Googling and doing a deep dive on. We tell students to scroll through their YouTube watch history and say, like, what do you care about? What are you curious about? And those types of things are things that you can absolutely put on the application. So extracurriculars are a great way to help the admission officer get to know you in a couple different fields, and you don't have to be point or don't have to be well-rounded. Being pointy is a-okay. Another way to discern between you and yourself or distinguish between yourself, I will get that right eventually, I promise, is to talk about the letters of recommendation. These are third-party insights into a student where a teacher or a counselor, at the very least, is talking about who your student is in that high school context. This can showcase who they are as a worker, as far as it may be a job, an outside recommendation coming from a job. Maybe it can be as a student, it can be as a classmate, as a contributor, as someone who is involved in their community overall. Typically, you want to ask at least 1 to 2 junior year core subject teachers. Some schools will have very strict requirements and say it must be one from a counselor, must be one from a teacher. Do not send us anything else. Sometimes it's two from a teacher, none from a counselor. It will really depend on the school you're applying to. But to cover your bases, at least ask your counselor and at least ask 1 to 2 junior year core subject teachers. For my juniors, please ask by the end of the year. Ask in person, follow up via email. We have lots of recommendations as far as what to include in that email, thanking them and also reminding them of the things that you did during that class that they like that you liked that might be really good to mention in a webinar or rather in a letter of recommendation. And then sometimes schools do allow for outside letters of recommendation. Um, Sometimes that third one can be a little bit interesting and show a different dimension. Jim, I think you had a story about a time you used your third letter of recommendation, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, Jordan and anyone who's worked in college admissions will tell you that the last thing an admissions officer needs is an extra thing to read for the most part. And that's why we tell students to be very discerning, to borrow one of Jordan's favorite words tonight, in determining whether to use that third letter or not. So I did choose to include an optional third letter with my college applications, and it was because my main extracurricular activity was track and field. But I was a late bloomer physically, so I was JV track and field for, freshman, sophomore, junior year. And that means that by college application season, I really had nothing to show for the fact that this was my main extracurricular activity in terms of kind of on paper accolades. Senior year, I was the captain of the team and I was the second highest scorer on our team. But it's a spring sport senior year, so colleges have already made their decisions by then, and I was going to get no credit for that. But my track and field coach was actually also my freshman year social studies teacher. And he gave me a lot of leadership roles on the team. So, for instance, I ran our fully automatic timing system at invitational meets. I helped set up for events. I was allowed to supervise other athletes in the weight room. If we have any lawyer parents, you might be jaws on the floor in shock and horror that they let us, 16-year-old supervise the weight room. But that used to, you were in high school, decades ago. You know how it used to be. So the point is, I was given a lot of responsibility. I was in leadership roles and I was working really, really hard. I just didn't have the physical attributes to really get there yet. So nothing that I could have said would have worked in this situation. Like, you can't write an essay about, did you know I'm actually the best JV track and field athlete of all time? That doesn't really work. If you win a state championship, you're at least varsity, then it speaks for itself. So instead, I had my track coach, who also knew me in the classroom, write that letter because he'd be able to give a specific level of insight that my other teachers just wouldn't have been able to. So because it was able to add context to what I felt should have actually been my strongest extracurricular activity that would have rung completely hollow without, that was a situation where it made sense to use the optional recommender.
And that's a great example of a time to use that because we're always looking for, with that extra letter of recommendation, a perspective that we're not getting elsewhere. Again, when I was in admission, I would say if I'm getting 7 letters that say she's great, she's great, she's great, I get it, she's great. But how are you great? What context are you seeing it in? So that's an example of a time that you can use an outside letter of recommendation. But again, please look at the college's requirements. There are some schools that say, do not send us another one. I do not want to read yet another letter on your application. Now, the last answer to how to distinguish yourself in this process, see, I used it correctly this time, is the essay and the application itself. Really, the essay is the ultimate distinguishing factor in this process. This is where you put yourself down on the page. This is how you speak directly to the admission officer. There are so many numbers and so many words on your application, and this is the time where you as a student get to have a conversation and showcase who you are as a person. The most important part about the Common Application essay, to back up for a second, the Common App essay is that 650-word essay that will go to every single school on the college list, with a couple of notable exceptions. We'll talk about that if we get there. But there are so many schools that will take this essay, and it's meant to showcase who you are as a human being. And it is not a writing sample. It is not meant to be the best piece of literature. You're not going to win the Poet Laureate Prize or anything like that. But it should be something that emblematizes who you are as a person and is still a legible piece of writing, of course. We want it to be legible and intelligible and representative of who you are as a person. Because the best essays are not the ones that are the best written, they're the ones that are the most personally insightful. Vulnerability is a huge word that we really encourage throughout our process. It's awkward to be vulnerable with a coach that maybe you don't know that well, but that's why we build that trust and have these conversations. But the more you can get vulnerable and the more you can share, the better these essays can be. When we start working together on these college essays and applications, brainstorming is the most important part. The number one question, the first question we ask you in your first assignment to start brainstorming for this process is, what do we need to know about you? And this is truly everything. Dump your entire brain or your student's entire brain into that Google document. This is the big flashy academic stuff. This is the big splashy academic things and extracurricular things as well. But it's also, almost more importantly, the small things that you don't think about all the time. That pistachios are your absolute favorite. That 4 is your favorite number, and here's why. That Thursdays are the best day of the week for you. That you are obsessed with rubber bands. Whatever it is, give us those small details because you truly never know what small detail will inspire us to have a conversation, ask a question, put down a comment, and that will really get to the nitty-gritty of who you are. And that's really the exciting part about this job is that we get to coach students throughout this process and show them that they do have something to say, that they do have things that are exciting and meaningful to them that showcases them as a person. Um, the number of times this year that I've heard, I never would have thought of that. That is like so like hit that like the nail on the head. Not to toot my own horn, but it does feel good to understand that students feel seen and heard in this process, and that is the number one thing that not only we as coaches are looking for, but also that the colleges are looking for as well. When they read your essay or your student's essay, they just want to understand who is coming to their university. What type of person are you going to be at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday, walking around campus, interacting with people, going to class, anything like that? So if we can get to the core as to who this student is, what and talk about what these things are that are important to you and why they're important to you, that will only help your case that much better. So there are so many ways to distinguish yourself in this process. I think the essays and applications are the best ways to do it. When everybody has an A, there are other ways that you can still make sure that you are standing out in this process.
All right. So that concludes everything we had prepared for today. At this point, we're happy to hang around as long as you all have questions. So Zoom has a Q&A function that you can drop questions into, or you can just type them into the chat. We'll hang around for any questions now. All right. Our first question is, uh, PSAT scores are going to be coming back later this month and into early November. What should we make of them for younger students? As in, so I think this question is getting at kind of two things. One is, what are the actual steps that you should take once you get a PSAT score from the process of planning for standardized testing? And the other is, kind of what level of improvement one can expect from PSAT scores. And so I'll answer it both ways. So for the first, the main thing I recommend when PSAT scores come back are to also try a practice ACT. And the reason for that is that colleges want to see, or colleges just want to see the highest score that you can get, and they don't care whether it's from the SAT or from the ACT. So that means that essentially students can figure out which of the two tests they're likely to do better on and then focus exclusively on that test. So I recommend take an ACT, compare the scores, and then see which one is stronger. That's a service we offer for free for anyone. So email us at info@myivexperience.com when you get the PSAT score. We can share with you a practice ACT, compare those scores, and get working. Then the second part is kind of when to do the prep. And if you're done with Algebra 2 and geometry as of the end of 10th grade, I recommend prepping in the summer before junior year and trying to knock the test out as early as possible. If you're taking Algebra 2 or geometry or the equivalent integrated math course during junior year, then I recommend taking the test for the first time toward the end of junior year. Another good question, what is a good SAT score range for a STEM student? So, there is no kind of easy answer to this question. It totally depends on the universities that you're interested in. So, what you can do is look up the average score ranges for the schools that you're interested in. Now, if you're talking specifically about engineering, typically the average SAT score is going to be a little higher for the engineering school than it is for the university overall. And they're going to weight the math a little more heavily than the verbal section. So it all has to be taken with a grain of salt. But it really does depend, on which schools you're targeting. Next question. Lots of SAT action today, Jordan.
It's
Uh,
okay. I'm not insulted.
Yeah, it is PSAT season, so a lot of people I think are thinking about standardized testing for the first time or the first
Mhm.
time in a while. Is the new SAT harder than the previous SAT? Is the score distribution different from previous years? This new SAT is not universally harder than the previous version of the SAT. The biggest difference that I observe in how scores shake out in this new version of the SAT is that they are more volatile. And what I mean by that is that a student's range of outcomes on any given day is wider on this version of the SAT than on the previous version. And there's a very simple answer to that. The SAT went from having 154 questions that counted to 90 questions that count. And so when you cut out a third of the questions, you're going to end up with every lucky and unlucky break counting more towards your score. So overall, the average score that I would expect from a student hasn't gone up or down, but the width of that range of scores has widened. Um, Next question. If you score 1560 at first attempt at the SAT, should the student attempt again if trying to get into schools like MIT? I have two answers to this question. The first answer is no. And typically 1550 is the score at which I say, like, look, that's enough for any school in the country. Once you're above 1550, your time would be better spent working on some of the other answers to the question from tonight, boosting your extracurricular resume, making sure your, grades are picture perfect, working on those other application factors. The one exception to that would be that MIT's median math score is 800. So, especially if you're looking for a STEM program at MIT, you really should have an 800 in the math section. That's for MIT specifically, not for the other universities. Other universities that are as selective as MIT don't have an average of 800 in the math section. So for MIT specifically, 800 in math would be the goal if like that's your dream school. Otherwise, 1560 is great. Congratulations on being done. All right, another question here. I'm shocked that you didn't mention differentiating yourself one time in this presentation. What is it that you need to hear that is different that makes you think that I'm a good candidate for the university?
I can tackle that. So there's not a one size fits all to differentiating yourself, right? It's a frustrating answer to say it depends because each student is different. And it's not to say that you need to be senior class president or you need to be the track captain or you need to be doing X, Y, and Z in order to be admitted to some of these places. And frankly, even with very strong test scores and things like that, as Jim mentioned earlier, this is a holistic process. So students with 15, 16, 50s have other differentiating factors or have ones that aren't as exciting as the other ones in the pool that make them not as interesting candidates or not as strong candidates in some of these highly selective institutions, right? So there's not one size fits all or one thing to do. I would joke sometimes when I would do information sessions with families that there's not like a golden phrase where like if you say this in your essay, you're automatically admitted like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. But it truly is that we colleges are just looking for who the student is. And I don't know if this is going to make you feel better or worse, but when I worked at a specific institution, our dean walked in and said, "We just made the class, 2,400 students, amazing. We have thousands of students on the wait list, and the reality is, if every single one of our 2,400 students said no, we could go to our wait list, pull a new class of 2,400 students, and nothing would change in our statistics. Same average GPA, same level of academic rigor, same average test score, same everything. So it really is those smaller factors. That doesn't say that you're not going to be successful at that institution. It just means that there was something else that another student had that you can't control that goes into making that holistic review process. So again, not a one size fits all. I recognize how frustrating that is. But again, just keep doing the things that you care about. And as long as you're putting yourself authentically on the page, that's the best that you can do.
Yeah, and I'll answer this in a slightly different way. So we have just over 27,000 high schools in the US. And that means we have probably just under 27,000 valedictorians. I'm sure a couple of them don't grade at all, right? So we have, say 26,000 valedictorians in the country. So if they all apply to Harvard, most of them aren't getting in, right? Because Harvard doesn't let in 26,000 students a year. And so when you think about trying to differentiate yourself, well, a basketball team is going to have more than one captain, right? So there's more than one captain at every high school that has a basketball team. And, FBLA treasurers, how many of those are there? So I think sometimes people can get lost in this idea of like, what do I do that's unique? What can you do that's unique? Anyone with a microphone can start a podcast. I mean, and that's not to say starting a podcast isn't a good idea if that's something you're passionate about. Of course it is. But the point is, if you focus too much on what's unique rather than what is actually going to lead to a fulfilling 4 years of high school, then you end up kind of burning your chance to differentiate yourself. Because what's really going to make you special and able to tell an authentic story is a life that you live for yourself. And so, the combination of things that you are is what differentiates you. So, I was the captain of a track team. I was top 10 in my high school class, and there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of students that those things are true about. What was unique about me? When I was injured in track and field, I would read philosophy books on the exercise bike. That's what I wrote my college essay about. And so like it's not about, like, well, I didn't really do anything unique. I took a rigorous course load and I also did well in a sport. That describes a lot of our high performing students, That's not unique. I wrote about the thing that makes me me, which is my intellectual curiosity that I expressed in that specific way. So the the point here is that, focusing on trying to find like your unique angle is just going to lead to a miserable search because nothing's all that unique. And so instead, be yourself and then tell a compelling story about it when you apply to college. All right, next question. If you get a B plus in an AP class but a 5 on the AP exam, what does that say about you? So this is a very complicated question, and I think the answer is always going to be it depends. And I think instead of thinking about it this way, I mean, the goal setting out in an AP class is twofold. It's get an A and get a 5 on the AP exam, right? And you start the year and that's what you want to do. And it's not about like kind of armchair quarterbacking yourself on Monday and thinking like, well, now that I got a B plus and a 5, what are they going to think about me? It's about looking at your grades in March and realizing like, oh wow, the best I can really do in this school year is like a B plus or A minus. What can I actually do to help myself right now? Well, you can get the absolute best grades you can possibly get for the rest of the year, and you can do your very best to get a 5 on the AP exam. So instead of looking in hindsight about like, well, what does it say about me that I only got a B plus in the class, but I got a 5 on the AP exam, focus on what's actually in your control, right? What can you do right now to help yourself? Because who knows what the human being on the other side of your application is going to subjectively think about what that says about you more broadly. And instead, you just have to focus on controlling the things that are in your control. If you have the B plus, it's going to be better that you get the 5 than if you get a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1. So go get the 5. And you just think about like the next thing in front of you. What can you actually do to help yourself? Because a question like this, it's not really helpful for planning the rest of your, preparation for college admissions. Next question. Do semester grades matter, or is it just the final class grade and final exam grade that matter? Jordan, in your experience reading high school transcripts and grades, uh, do you pay much close attention or have you to the semester grades, or you care more about the final course grade?
It depends, which is the most common answer in college admissions, which is quite unfortunate, and I acknowledge how frustrating that is. As Jim said earlier, some schools take weighted GPA, some schools don't take weighted GPA, some schools recalculate things like that. So that'll be a policy that's individually responsible, or that the school is individually responsible for. The unhelpful answer is that you just need to do the best that you can for both this first semester grade and the final grade as well. That being said, there are some schools that are going to individually tally up the number of semester A's, semester B's, semester C's, and D's and F's if there are any, and recalculate your GPA that way. They will take the semester, they won't necessarily take the final year because they want to see what you're doing in both semesters. The part where semester grades really do matter is first semester senior year grades. So if you apply anywhere early action or early decision, and you are deferred, which means that you are not given a final admission decision and that they defer that decision to the spring, the colleges will then ask for your first semester senior year grades. Those semester senior year grades, or trimester if you're on a trimester, those grades do matter a lot. For your first semester junior year, first semester sophomore year, things like that, again, depending on how the school reads your transcript, they may or may not take a look at those. If your school only offers final grades, then you can't go back and ask for semester grades. So that's something the admission officer is going to know and be able to look at it that way. So kind of depends, please do your best on both of those. But then also, if there are any seniors in the room, for example, don't take your foot off the gas pedal because if you are deferred, those first semester grades have made or broken a decision for sure.
One other specific way that semester grades can matter is if you, as a student, you experience some kind of medical or mental health issue that makes it hard for you to keep up with your coursework for a certain time of the year. If that shows like a slip in your grades, and you can write in the additional information section of your essay, I had mono from, January through, April of my junior year. And if admissions officers can go corroborate, like, yeah, that's a dip in the grades, and it wasn't there in any of the other semesters other than the ones that overlapped with that specific illness that the student was working through, then that's an example where they might actually look at that kind of thing. But yeah, for the most part, it's as Jordan said. All right. That covers all of our questions. If you have anything else or anything highly specific to your student or you're interested in our specific coaching on any of these factors, please reach out info@myivexperience.com or you can call and text our office number there. We're really looking forward to continuing the conversation with you all and have a great Tuesday night. Bye, everybody.
Everyone.